I think there's a few things that people often get wrong about Ethereum, and the first is that we don't have like a coordinated vision, right? The North Star, and that's just wrong. Justin is leading a lot of this charge around Based Rollups and now the Beam chain, but there's a coordinated vision for what Ethereum wants to do, and that is the Rollup Centric roadmap. It really hasn't changed that much.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Uniswap Labs, who is launching the largest bug bounty program in the entire history of crypto. It's a $15.5 million program. This is aiming to be the most rigorously reviewed code base ever deployed to Ethereum. So if you want more eligibility on the scope, rewards, payouts, etc., just click the link in the bottom of the show notes, tell them that I sent you. You'll be hearing all about Uniswap Labs later in the program. Hey everyone, quick disclaimer before we get into today's episode. Nothing said on Bell Curve is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Our guests and I may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Today I'm joined by Matthew, aka Mteam of Spire Labs. Matthew, welcome.
Nice to be on.
Hey man, this is great. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to chat to you about, mostly based rollups, which I feel like you're becoming increasingly the face of on Twitter. So congratulations about that. And
Thank you.
and you know, maybe before we even get there, I'm going to reverse the order here, and I actually want to get your 10,000 foot view on the state of the union around Ethereum. So I feel like we talked about this a little bit when I saw you in Bangkok, but and I listened to the chat that you did on Bankless, which I thought you addressed this in a very interesting way. But you know, before we get into it, because we're going to get into the weeds of the different flavors of base rollups that exist and how you see the future of base rollups playing out on Ethereum. Talk to me about the current state of the union. How are you feeling about the rollup centric roadmap, the current vibes around Ethereum? Give me your thoughts.
Sure. I think there's a few things that people often get wrong about Ethereum, and the first is that we don't have like a coordinated vision, right? The North Star. And that's just wrong. Like you can talk to Ethereum researchers and they almost always agree. Justin is leading a lot of this charge around Based Rollups and now the Beam chain. But there's a coordinated vision for what Ethereum wants to do, and that is the Rollup Centric roadmap. It really hasn't changed that much. Now, what people really start to get wrong is around value accrual, because the idea of value accrual is something that only Ethereum has to deal with. Like every other blockchain has even worse value accrual thesis than Ethereum. Like Solana totally will post memes of Sol just being used as spam prevention, and people make fun of Ethereum for value accrual. That doesn't make any sense to me. I think the rollup centric roadmap has like a gaping hole in the middle. Like how do we all make money? And people tend to focus on this way more than they do on like the actual point of the rollup centric roadmap, which is parallel innovation at scale, right? How do we reuse one layer one and extend it to lots of layer twos? I think part of the confusion around these kind of roll up teams is all mimetic, right? It's really not that hard to move between layer twos. That's just the state of things. You can use a cross. It takes 2 seconds. That's insane. But there is a confusion for retail users. There's even for us, like I just hate using bridges. It requires me to open up another website and then I'm clicking a couple buttons, even if it's only 1 or 2 transactions. It is just a pain because of the kind of mental strain. And so these are things that are like real problems that we need to fix, but they are not nearly as bad as kind of the technical things, because I think we are figuring these out. So there's been a few interop related panels that went on at DEF CON where people talked about the kind of interop between existing layer twos. I believe that all of these interop discussions have focused around asynchronous composability, and I don't think that's good enough. And I think we can still do synchronous composability. I've not given up yet. And so that's part of what I want to talk about today with Based Rollups. But also, I want to just make it clear that like all of the problems that Solana people, our app developers are bringing up are all things that are being solved without Based Rollups. Like you don't need any new technology to solve the problems that we're encountering today. The biggest one that I think that the other kind of pushes don't solve is value accrual, and the question of how do we all make money. And that's what I address at Bankless Summit. Like I think that lobs are nice, the burn is also nice, but they're just not anywhere near the scale of like a multi-billion-dollar asset.
All right, so let me ask you about that first point that you just made, which is the North Star. And this is a very interesting debate from my perspective, because you've got one group that says, hey, there's clearly no North Star and people are building in many different directions and it feels very discordant. On the other hand, you have a group of people that say there's a clear North Star. All you got to do is talk to anyone at the Ethereum Foundation or anyone who's building a client team or et cetera. And there's a lot of consensus. So, if you were to articulate the North Star of Ethereum, how would you do that?
I think it hasn't changed, and it's still the Rollup Centric roadmap. The goal is to improve the layer 1 as if there were no users on layer 1 and only activity on layer 2s, only users and activity on layer 2s. There's a ton of things that we can do to get there, but these are all kind of like path things, not North Star things. So native rollups, based rollups, interop between layer 2s, account abstraction for using an account across multiple chains. These are all things that are on the way to getting there. But the goal is to give layer 2s the ability to express whatever they want on top of a single layer 1. This has not changed. I don't know why this is so confusing to people. The Rollup Centric roadmap means that we don't care about layer 1 activity or users anymore, and we want to accelerate the adoption and innovation on layer 2s as much as possible. So the merge was a great example of this. EIP 4FA4 is an even better example, I guess, where we dramatically brought down costs for users on layer 2s, but did not dramatically affect like the congestion on layer 1. At least that wasn't the goal. So I think all of the planned upgrades for Ethereum are kind of centered around this vision, is making the layer 1 the best layer 1 possible for layer 2s. Now, the place this North Star starts to break down is that not everyone agrees what kind of layer 2s we should support. Like if they use Alt-DA, should we still try to make their lives better? Should we support them on Twitter? And some people disagree on what exactly the layer 1 should do. So some people say only settlement. Some people add on DA. Based rollups add on sequencing. There's just this kind of ongoing discussion about what is important to have kind of logically centralized onto the layer 1 that people can innovate off of, and what is better to leave entirely up to layer 2s, at the expense of more fragmentation.
So are you a believer then in the sense that, right, what we're trading off here is, this is kind of the B2B versus B2B versus B2C vision of Ethereum, which is, we used to have Ethereum layer 1 as this sort of economic zone where a lot of users would actually directly interact with DeFi products or whatever it is. And now we're going to migrate those users up to layer 2s, and Ethereum is going to transition to this B2B chain that services layer 2s. In exchange for that, what you get is you unlock a whole bunch of users that you otherwise might not have gotten on the layer 2 side, and you get to export ETH, and sort of the liquidity network effects, monetary premium, whatever you want to call it, ETH the asset, more than pays for the loss in execution fees. Is that roughly the way that you think about things?
Yeah, I really like what Tolly and Mert will say to this, which is that the execution fees have like an upper bound, right? There's only so much kind of capacity. So Tolly will say there's like some amount of money to run a validator every month, right? And this is kind of your upper bound, your margin for execution fees. And we can expect this to like dramatically increase, but overall execution just really isn't that expensive. Bandwidth costs are going down. And quite frankly, like this is not the kind of value accrual that you want to hear for $100 billion asset, right? And perhaps it will end up that I guess then the question is, how do we get the most monetary premium? Is it by maintaining activity on layer 1, requiring all users to pay gas in native token, right, in ETH? Or do we try to export that to layer 2s? And the problem with exporting it is that there's no way to enforce that layer 2s actually contribute to the monetary premium at all. They could use their own gas token. They could use the Alt-DA, right? So you can't enforce anything that layer 2s do. That's the whole point. But this is not like an uneducated bet. Like, this is very calculated bet. People sat down and said the gas upper bound for value accrual is quite low if we were just to talk about a single chain activity. But burning tokens contributes to monetary premium because of these deflationary aspects. People have to buy the token to spend it, right? But when you export it to layer 2s, you create opportunities for these businesses to thrive based on the network effects of an asset. So if you are a layer 2 and you choose to use ETH, then you should choose to use ETH not because of some like debt to layer one, but rather because ETH is the best, right? And because Ethereum is providing a valuable service in the form of sequencing or DA or whatever. And so people will talk about like Ethereum being second best. Like that's not our goal at all. We want to be the best at DA, like better than all the alt DA providers. We want to be the best at sequencing, better than whatever shared sequencer rotating round robin set you wanted to come up with, and the best money, the best token. And I don't think this is like at all out of the question because it's much too early to claim that Ethereum will not be able to reach that scale because we literally have a roadmap to getting there. It's called the Beam chain for consensus. There's similar proposals in the works for DA. I can't show too much about that. Then on execution, we have ways to really scale up L1.
Okay, so I want to get to this point around value accrual because this is where I see the based rollup vision, at least in the way that you've described it, maybe solving this trade-off of exporting users and what you're getting in return is the liquidity network effects for ETH the asset. So maybe this is a good point to introduce. I know probably if you're a listener of Bell Curve, you have heard me talk about based rollups before, but can you just give us an overview of what based rollups are and where they slot into this question of value accrual for ETH and how they help balance some of these trade-offs that we're talking about?
Sure. So first, the definition is in order. I think the easiest way to understand a based rollup is just by looking at the sequencing aspect of things. So there's rollups have to do kind of three important things, which are execution, DA, and the third is sequencing. Execution and DA, in this case, you can use whatever you want. But for that sequencing, you need to use Ethereum. And when I say Ethereum, I don't mean Ethereum validators. I mean the same sequencing as Ethereum, which happens to be MEV-boost for the most part. And so in practice, this means that you delegate sequencing rights for your layer 2 to a validator, to Ethereum layer 1 validator, who then delegates those sequencing rights to a builder through MEV-boost auction. And the eventual effects of this are that the winner of the MEV-boost auction is also the winner of the layer 2 auction because it's just the same auction. And so what we call the shared sequencing when there's the same sequencer for multiple domains. And then the little extra piece that we add on top is called atomic settlement or atomic block proposals that allow the layer 1 block to include a layer 2 block. It's really like a commitment to a layer 2 block, but you can think about it about being the layer 2 block. And so if the layer 1 block doesn't get proposed because there's like a liveness failure, or it gets reorged out of the chain or something like that, or fails to be finalized for some reason, then the same thing happens to the layer 2. And because of these properties, we enable something called synchronous composability between the layer 1 and layer 2, which means in the simplest terms, you can do cross-chain contract calls and do everything you can do on the layer 1 directly with the layer 2 seamlessly and back and forth. So, this is such a paradigm shift that people don't understand yet. If you have a token on layer 1, you have the Sky token, whatever, and you want to use this on layer 2. Instead of bridging the Sky token and creating like a synthetic version or wrapped version on layer 2, you can just call the balance request on layer 1 on the layer 1 token. And so there's no need to move state between domains anymore because you can seamlessly communicate between different domains. And the nicest thing about this is that it doesn't require like rewriting your code. So you can literally just copy and paste from layer 1, deploy on a layer 2. It is a based rollup. And if it is synchronously composable, then all of your code will work the exact same way. You don't have to deal with message passing. You don't have to get your code re-audited or rewritten. And this is so important because we've spent 8 years of blockchain development working on synchronously composable development. So every smart contract written and every kind of developer resource, all of the developer tooling is built around this like synchronously composable model. And when we introduce asynchronous composability, the developer complexity like shoots up 10 times. This is one reason why bridges often get hacked, right? If bridges were synchronously composable, then it'd be so much easier to reason about. But because there's this element of asynchronicity, even if it's very fast message passing, it's still so much more complicated to reason about. Bridges end up getting hacked.
All right, so I've got a whole bunch of questions there, but before we get into it, I want to help us understand. We were talking a little bit at DevCon about the 4 different flavors, that you saw of based sequencing, or based rollups in general. So give us a sense of what are the different design possibilities that are out there now that we've got the high level idea.
Sure. So there's what I just described is like what based rollups are at the foundation. But there's all sorts of different teams that are taking this like core idea and like forking it and twisting it into their own different flavors. I think to start, there's Justin's original idea, which is just called base sequencing on ETH research, and it's a type of base sequencing that we now call total anarchy, because there's no rules to define who is the sequencer ahead of time. The sequencer is just is basically defined after the fact. So you don't know who the sequencer was until they've finalized the block on chain. And that has the unfortunate downside that you can't do pre-confirmations. And if you can't do pre-confirmations, then that is a worse user experience. But it's not the end of the world. And honestly, Total Anarchy is a really elegant, clean design. Tycho uses it. And if you're smart about the implementation, it can work pretty well. Except that you also lose all your MEV to layer 1. And people don't like that. And so vanilla-based sequencing is kind of the next iteration from the Lime chain people. And the fundamental idea with vanilla-based sequencing is to add sequencer election beforehand instead of after the fact. And you use this to capture some MEV, not a ton. And ultimately, the goal is to offer pre-confirmations. So you have a look ahead of Based Rollup sequencers, just like you do on layer 1. And then from there, people have forked out into multiple different directions. There are Spire, my company, and Gwyneth, kind of a subsidiary of Tycho, who are building these rollups with complex sequencer election mechanisms. And so instead of just saying always delegate to layer 1 or always do it in some external way, then you kind of build an auction that favors the layer 1 but doesn't like unilaterally give them sequencing rights. And that essentially gives you the ability to run an auction among layer 1 proposers, allowing them to bid on the right to propose a block, which if you're the beneficiary of that auction means you can retain some MEV. And so both of these designs are rather complex, and I don't want to get into them here, but there are a few other ideas as well. So Rise is working on a very high performant based rollup, and their kind of sequencer election is kind of still to be determined, but it's rather interesting. There's some talks about that. And then Rogue is another one who are doing kind of the total anarchy route, but they're very interesting product. It's like a Bitcoin purist based rollup. And there's also Nethermind Surge, who are doing something very similar to Tycho. Puffer is also doing something similar to Tycho. And so there's these kind of all of these branches of based rollup development. I believe that Spire and Gwyneth are on the most correct track in terms of like capturing MEV for applications, but also getting that synchronous composability as well. But so we'll see how it plays out.
I want to get a sense of, Matthew, the different trade-off spectrum here. So here's the way that I kind of think about these different flavors or designs that you just described. On the two poles here, I think there's the value accrual here, which is what we're talking about is some sort of combinatorial MEV type auction where MEV gets split in between the L1 versus L2s and apps, right? So it's kind of like what is the appropriate balance there. And then I think there's a performance angle here as well, but correct me if I'm wrong, because Tycho, my understanding is that you just inherit the 12-second block times of Ethereum, right, which is probably slightly less desirable from a rollup standpoint. But then obviously there are other based rollups which are pushing the boundary there. Is that roughly the right way to think about the trade-offs in terms of the different designs and flavors out there, or help me understand that?
Yeah, it's not a smooth gradient though. So there's like a certain point where you step function into we can have much shorter than 12-second block times. And there's also a certain point where you start to retain near the limit of MEV that can be retained by like a controlling your sequencing and auctioning that. And so yeah, correct. There's like these kind of two spectrums. The other two that you should think about are liveness. So like, what is the liveness trust assumptions of your rollup? Is it the same as Ethereum? Is it worse than Ethereum? And censorship resistance, which is, are you inheriting the censorship resistance properties of Ethereum or something less than that? Or maybe even a superset of that if you are willing to sacrifice liveness as well.
So I have a question for you. In the event that, let's say there was some sort of, Ethereum has really been designed to avoid these sorts of things as opposed to tendermint or something like that, a different type of consensus mechanism. But let's say there were some sort of liveness failure on the L1. Does the L2 have the option to step in and these systems rely on based confirm or base pre-confs, right? Or pre-confirmations from the L1. Would there be the ability for the L2 to kind of step in and say, hey, we're having some difficulties with the L1. We're just going to step in and provide pre-comps until the L1 is back online type thing as some sort of fail-safe.
Yes, it's possible to implement like that. Like I think the espresso people will get really mad about when people get this wrong. But basically, there is when you delegate sequencing, it doesn't have to be a permanent thing. Like you don't need to lock in your sequencing forever. You can always transition to a fallback. That fallback could just be a centralized sequencer. It could be you're moving from an auction to total anarchy, which is what a lot of Based Rollups do today. And I think with something like that, where there's a layer 1 liveness failure, you'd mostly be screwed. Like you're not going to be able to produce blocks, but you can still give out pre-confirmations. The question is, there's like moving back from that to base sequencing, like from these centralized pre-confirmations to base sequencing, is going to be really complicated. And if that fail-safe mechanism isn't designed well, then you're gonna get in a lot of trouble. But in most cases, we don't actually have to worry about that because Ethereum Layer 1 has like 100% uptime, 100% liveness. And so the kind of the risk, this tail risk of Layer 1 having a liveness problem is rather low compared to if you're using like another consensus mechanism.
And I know you mentioned that you couldn't really get into some of the specifics here, but anything that you can tell me about what the auction actually looks like that splits, that makes it a little bit more competitive, but slightly favors the L1 versus the L2? Like, I would love to just get a sense of roughly how you're thinking about the design and maybe just a couple examples of how that could work theoretically in practice.
Sure. So here's a kind of a thought experiment. If you created like a purely permissionless auction, but gave the kind of the ability to participate to anyone, so it's completely permissionless, then the winner of this auction would be whoever can get the most value out of what they purchase, right? Because they can bid more, and that's kind of like generally true. There's some details that you have to worry about, but let's just pretend it's permissionless, and whoever can derive the most value will win. Now, the kind of the bet that we're making is that sequencing with a layer 1, shared sequencing with a layer 1, will be the most valuable way to use a layer 2 block in any case. So it'll be a better product than just using a centralized isolated sequencer or even a shared sequencer between multiple layer 2s. The bet is that layer 1 will be the most valuable to compose with. And that means that in many cases, the layer 1 will win that auction anyway, because they'll just be able to outbid all of the shared sequencers and all the centralized sequencers because they can derive more economic value from composing with layer 1 versus composing with another domain. So the auction design doesn't even have to be that special to get this property that we want, which is that the layer 1 usually wins, because the layer 1 just has an advantage anyway because of all those network effects. But the things do get complicated if you want to maintain kind of consistency from the perspective of layer 1. And so what Spire and Gwyneth do is sell what we call tickets in a permissionless auction to to anyone, right? So anyone can participate. But actually using these tickets can only be done by a layer 1 proposer. And this means that anyone can win the auction and hold the tickets, but to actually use the tickets and derive any economic value from them, you either have to sell them to someone who can use them directly or use them directly yourself by burning them to propose a block. So the auction design is kind of carefully done so that the layer 1 should win the auction because they derive the most value, but also so that they are the only ones who can use those tickets. And that kind of favors the layer 1 again, but also means that the kind of consistent user experience of using like base pre-confirmations is the same. And you don't have this kind of like switching between layer 1 and layer 2, which very well might happen if you have like a massive volatility event and layer 1 is exceptionally valuable, but then there's an arbitrage with layer 2. So then you do that and then you go back to layer 1, and that's just messy. And so this kind of the auction design thesis is giving the layer 1 proposer an advantage in this auction. Now, Espresso and their Based Espresso project do another interesting thing, which is that they give the layer 1 proposer a last look. So they run the auction, and then there's like a winning bid that's been decided by their off-chain auction. And then the layer 1 proposer has the option to take that bid or let the winner of the auction actually take it. And so they can always get in at the best possible price. And so that gives them an advantage. But I don't believe it's that design will end up necessarily reflecting like all of the properties that they want because of they don't have atomic block proposals anyway. Now the other thing I think it's useful to mention here is that the auction doesn't have to be the only way to distribute sequencing rights. Like you could distribute 99% of sequencing rights through an auction, and then the last 1% you could just give to your friends or give to solo stakers, right? You could do anything you want with these tickets. It's like you have the sovereignty to distribute those. An auction is the best way if you want to capture MEV. But if you have other kind of priorities like centric resistance, liveness, you want to like look good on L2B, then you might consider donating your tokens to a public good or to solo stickers to kind of get those properties as well.
Okay, so I got one more question for you on the mechanics here. How do you price pre-confs? So one of the challenges here that I would guess is that we're talking about the difference between an ex post and an ex ante auction. Like when I'm thinking about the MEV boost type auction that ends up getting run, is you're almost trying to extend time, right, to get as much of a look as you possibly can at all the different transactions that are coming in, and then you place your bid, you win it or you lose it, and then everything gets executed. But in the instance of pre-comps, I think you'd have to switch that, right? You would actually have to price the pre-comps before the block ends up getting built. So my guess is that you'd have to have some sort of sophisticated entity that would do that. And I would guess also that you can't price quite as accurately. So there'd be some sort of loss of welfare, right? Am I roughly getting that right? Or how does the pricing work for pre-comps?
It depends. Yeah. So there's a lot of different pre-conf teams that work on different things here. I'll tell you what Justin's kind of idea is. The goal kind of the main priority is to you have a kind of a two-sided marketplace here. You have proposers who want one thing, which is to make as much money as possible for their stakers, and you have users who want two things. The first is like speed; they want faster pre-confirmations, and the second is cost. But you don't know exactly where the user kind of preference is along that curve of speed and cost. And so what the pre-conf teams have kind of aligned on is this concept of a gateway, which represents the proposer. The proposer delegates to the gateway. And this gateway is like a sophisticated entity, kind of like a relay is maybe a good analogy here. And then what the gateway can do is run whatever auction mechanism they want internally using TEs or whatever to price pre-confirmations on behalf of the proposer. And then if they're using TEs, kind of like verify that they are not cheating the proposer or not cheating the user. And so it's kind of a trusted third party here. I don't think that design is going to be very effective without proposers and users kind of having their own representative. So if the gateway is representing users and proposers, then TEs help with like verifiability, but they don't help with censorship resistance. So if that gateway wanted to give a little edge to the proposers, then they could, or a little edge to the users, then they could, and then users would kind of flock to the gateway that offers that little edge. And so I think having a kind of a multi-representative market makes a little bit more sense, where a gateway represents proposers, and then a RPC or router represents users who can kind of almost hold gateways at ransom with their order flow to keep those gateways honest. But yeah, this is kind of a complicated area because it depends very much on what type of pre-confirmation you're doing. You could be doing like a independent subslot auction, which is like all the transactions you do them independently and then just kind of figure out how to actually resolve all the differences at the end of the block. Or you could do dependent subslot auctions, which is very similar to what every layer 2 does today with their own pre-confirmations, where they build like a full block with all of the transactions ordered and executed every X number of seconds, and then batch these to n times X, to Ethereum at n times X, right? So there's like a batch includes many blocks. And this kind of changes based on like the block time. But the point is that the layer 2s are building blocks before and just pre-confirming these before they actually batch to Ethereum, and they could lie about what they post to Ethereum anyway. And so these pre-confirmations are not backed by anything. In this case, it's like the same thing. You could just produce shreds or chunks or blocks or whatever you want to call them before the block time is over. So new construct is working on something like this, where they have 1 second block times, and then just aggregate all these blocks together into a single Ethereum block and post this to Ethereum later. And so all of these pre-conf designs have very different kind of pricing properties, because with doing dependent subset auctions, you're selling your access to some of your state earlier. You're also like effectively reducing your block time, and you could get kind of sub-slot granularity arbitrage, which could end up making you even more money. Now, unfortunately, the research shows that like independent subset auctions are bad for proposers in terms of MEV. But that doesn't mean that they are necessarily bad for proposers net, right? Because users very well could be willing to pay for pre-confirmations. Maybe AI agents will pay, I don't know. But you could end up kind of resolving that difference in loss of MEV for independent subset auctions with more tips.
Matthew, could I actually ask you to just do a little bit of a definition? When you say subset auction, just define what that is and what's the difference between independent versus dependent?
So a subset auction is kind of selling access to state at a lower granularity than the slot itself. So Ethereum 12 seconds, if you're doing any auction at a level below that, that's subset auction. Independent would mean that each of these auctions are taking place independently of each other. And so if you get 100 pre-confirmation requests, maybe you're running 100 different auctions to price each of these kind of independently. So maybe you have you chunk them by groups of state or whatever. There's ways to get around some of the complexity here, but basically all of these subset auctions are you're giving them access to the state at the end of the block before the end of the slot, right? So the state access is like independent.
Got it. And am I correct in assuming here that the dominant use case would just be maybe to start with something like a top of block versus rest of block auction here? Is that roughly the way that?
For sure. So yeah, so the independent property lets you sell like different pieces of state or different bits of ordering in the final block. But the point of a dependent subset auction is to sell a state access that doesn't extend to the end of the slot. So maybe you sell state access for now or the next 1 second instead of the block, whatever it will be, in 12 seconds. And so at some point between this 1 second sub slot kind of chunk and the end of the slot, prices could change, and you could do another dependent sub slot auction for that state again. And so that you're buying a different thing as an arbitrager, as a user, but the properties end up being rather different for the proposer. But there's a lot more research to kind of figure out what those actually are.
All right, everyone, listen up. Like I said at the top of the episode, Uniswap Labs is rolling out the red carpet and launching a $15.5 million bug bounty. This is the largest bug bounty in the entire history of crypto to anyone that can find a critical bug with the Uniswap v4 protocol. This bug bounty aims to make it the most rigorously reviewed code base ever deployed to Ethereum. Now, the Uniswap name is basically synonymous with security. $2.4 trillion in cumulative volume has passed through Uniswap v2 and v3 without a single hack. So Uniswap v4 is dedicated to bringing that same level of security and transparency to the v4 protocol. So if you want more information or eligibility or scope or rewards or payout or any of that good stuff, there's a link in the bottom of the show notes. I highly recommend that you stop listening right now, go to the show notes, click the link, head over and tell them that I sent you. Start earning money today.
All right, I want to zoom back out here for a second and talk about the value proposition here from the standpoint of users of L2s, but also the L2s themselves. So, when we're talking about something like an auction that slightly favors L1 proposers versus the L2, I'm just curious, and I'm sure you've talked to many different teams who are investigating, launching a based rollup versus launching like an OP stack or Arbitrum Orbit type rollup. And I would just be curious, when I hear that, I guess from the standpoint of an L2, I'm thinking, well, why would I be entering an auction here for my block space that favors, an L1 that I'm not going to have access to those revenues? So, talk me through what it's like having conversations with some of these, maybe app developers that are thinking about launching a based rollup versus just a sort of vanilla Arbitrum Orbit rollup or something like that.
Sure. So usually the conversations are not necessarily like OP stack is the alternative. It's rather like building an app on another monolithic layer 2 or general purpose layer 2 or layer 1.
Sure.
And so if the alternative is base, then a base rollup will capture more MEV because Base doesn't give you any MEV, and we'll also capture way more congestion fees. So the top apps on Base make $0 from the congestion fees that they generate. It all goes to Coinbase, and so the alternative with the Base rollup is that you can capture 100% of congestion fees and then some double-digit percentage of MEV. But of course we don't know what that is. Now the sell for these applications is that the loss that you're kind of giving up in MEV is worth it because your congestion fees will increase as your state becomes more valuable, and your kind of overall MEV will increase because you're able to do arbitrage, atomic arbitrage, with more domains. So if you can just do arbitrage internally, then you that's valuable. But let's say you can capture 100% of that. That might be significantly less than 80% of arbitrage with kind of more domains, so including Ethereum. And so the pitch goes like this: it's like you're getting less MEV as a percentage, but the actual numbers are very likely dramatically more. And compared to alternatives like launching on a general purpose layer 2, that is kind of the only other way to get this synchronously composability property at scale. You're not getting any congestion fees, you're not getting any MEV. And so it's like almost always a strictly better option. The reason we don't often see like OP-Stack framed as a competitor is because OP-Stack just does not offer the composability that a lot of our apps need. And so if you're a lending protocol and you want to use tokens on layer 1, creating a good synthetic wrapped version of these assets on layer 2 is a pain. And doing things like liquidations using layer 1 liquidity is just impossible. You can't do that. And so the alternative for these applications is either launching on layer 1 or launching on a layer 2. But I think the base rollup is like the obviously better option because you're not getting scammed out of your congestion and MEV.
Yeah. So was it surprising? I mean, I guess when I looked at some of the DeFi 1.0 giants, I kind of squinted at them and thought maybe some sort of based rollup construction would make a lot of sense for them. So something like Uniswap would actually make quite a bit of sense to me, or something like Aave, right? Maybe Aave is actually an even better example where the liquidity hub is still on L1. They have a bunch of different deployments across different L2s that bear some amount of bridging risk, or even different chains. Like I saw Aave is moving over to Solana. And so there's a challenge there from a governance standpoint, there's a bridge risk standpoint, whatever it is. And so I guess based if Aave was based rollup, that wouldn't solve the Solana challenge. But I am still curious. I mean, when you look at any apps in particular that this makes a lot of sense for, like who is the ideal customer for a based construction?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with like layer 1 DeFi. Lending protocols to make a ton of sense. I think the question for some of these big apps is like, what's our actual priority with launching on layer 2s? Is it really scale? Because in most cases it's not. It's actually distribution. It's like we recognize that there's a lot of retail users on Arbitrum, so we want to deploy there to just have a larger market. And I think the set of applications that actually launch on a layer 2 or their own layer 2 for scale is rather limited. Most of them want to customize things that you can't do on a layer 2, or rather have like want to give off some kind of impression that they're an infra play because it boosts their token valuation, or somehow changes like the public perception of their protocol. Now, this complicates things quite a bit because like we've seen evidence of top DeFi protocols launching app chains, right? Unichain, Aave soon, and I think that this demonstrates the idea that there's like large apps, it makes sense to launch an app chain just because they have the money to kind of support that complexity. But for smaller applications, it's a much harder sell because like all of the off-chain infrastructure is not cheap. It's not too expensive, but it is thousands of dollars every month. And there's a bunch of like other kind of on-chain services that you would need to like recreate on an app chain for some applications. Oracle is probably the best example, where you might be paying millions of dollars to deploy oracles on your app chain. And I actually think based rollups are an interesting solution to this problem because all of the layer 2s can reuse the on-chain infra that takes place, exists on layer 1. So Chainlink oracles are already deployed on layer 1. So if you'd like to use those on a layer 2, you can just make a contract call. Like there's no change to if you were actually on layer 1. So I think that resolves a lot of the on-chain infra questions. But for a lot of layer 1 data protocols, it's not so much about scale and customization as it is about distribution and reaching more users. And so kind of the cost benefit analysis is a little bit different there.
I want to zoom out here and get a sense from you about how you think this rollup centric roadmap, if that is the North Star for Ethereum, ends up playing out. Because the way that I've at least been thinking about it is there are a couple of different potential futures for how rollups could end up existing on Ethereum, and I've sort of bucketed them into 3 different groups. There is the status quo, which, and I mean this not as a shot at all at different frameworks that exist, but it looks a little walled garden-y to me in the sense that you have very separate execution environments that don't interoperate with one another. And I think that's partially because there hasn't been enough prioritization, which is changing in Ethereum today. But still, you kind of have a base user is probably pretty sticky to base versus an Arbitrum user, which is pretty sticky to Arbitrum. And I'm not sure, it's very easy to interoperate between the two of them. So that's why I say it looks a little walled garden-y. And although you do get great interoperability in between different OP stack chains and Arbitrum Orbit chains, et cetera. So you kind of maybe end up with 2 or 3 dominant frameworks that are great interoperability in between one another, and then maybe some sort of across powered system in between the different rollup frameworks. So that's one potential future. Then maybe there's another potential future, which is a maybe shared sequencer plus ag layer type thing, which is the interoperability in between rollups is not provided by the L1, but it's instead provided by third-party infrastructure providers like the Espressos of the world and the Polygons potentially, where you have some sort of, I think ZK plays a pretty big part in this future where maybe proving costs end up getting driven down. The latency is also driven down and it's very cheap. So everything gets proved in either an off-chain or different very heterogeneous execution environments. Everything gets batched and then submitted down to the L1 with the help of something like a shared sequencer, right? So maybe that's future 2. And then future 3 is the base rollup future that you're describing here. And to be honest, maybe to editorialize my own opinion, I think that the base rollup future is probably the best future for both users and Ethereum as well. My concern is just that, you'd be starting from basically, if there was a race, you've already got the incumbents, 200 meters out of a 500 meter dash. And you kind of are starting from square one here. So how would you, if we're having this conversation 5 years out, what would you think about the most likely scenario for how this could all play out?
Sure. So I think number 1 is almost impossible. Like there's a ton of social pressure to avoid these walled garden layer 2s. When Vitalik starts pushing something, then it moves pretty quickly. I think future 2, which is shared sequencer plus ag layer, is kind of directionally correct, but will have like a cold start problem. Like there are no shared sequencers today with kind of any meaningful adoption. And kind of future 3, which is the base rollup, and I would add in ag layer here because I think that is useful for base sequencing too. The only difference to the shared sequencing vision is that the shared sequencer is Ethereum, and one of the participants in the shared sequence domain of these networks is Ethereum layer 1. And so, first of all, having the credible neutrality of the Ethereum sequencer is absolutely crucial to kind of the coordination. I can't imagine Optimism using the Arbitrum shared sequencer, and I can't imagine the other way around either. But if there was an Ethereum sequencer that everyone could agree had the technical properties that we need, then I think that it'd be much, much easier to have social coordination around that based sequencer, Ethereum. And then on the second side around kind of losing the race, disruption, I want to just highlight here that the most drastic difference between the shared sequencer and base sequencer vision is not necessarily neutrality, although Justin does like that, but it's rather that Ethereum layer 1 is already a part of the base sequencer network. And so, you can check the chain. There is more TVL on Ethereum than every layer 2 combined. There's more volume on Ethereum than most layer 2s. There is more activity, just by kind of the types of transactions. A lot of apps like lending protocols still are primarily used on layer 1, and quite frankly, there's a massive network effect built around the token of layer 1 around ETH. And there's a whole bunch of off-chain infrastructure things too. Like, the Ethereum layer 1 is a part of every wallet. It's already integrated into every wallet. Things like this that are network effect for layer 1 that other layer 2s don't have. And so if you want to argue that base rollups are losing, then you also have to, by definition, take the position that the layer 1 is losing to layer 2s, and the numbers just don't support that. The kind of data clearly shows that Ethereum is still the dominant chain in the Ethereum ecosystem, and it's not layer 2s. And so, that's changing. But I believe in the next few months that we'll have really good base rollups that start to come online, and that will expand access to that Ethereum layer 1 network effect and kind of stop the bleeding. I don't know if that kind of makes sense as a case for the third future.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And I think that probably, like, even if you look at, I don't know, there's a term here around, I've been using it, which is service model, which is, I'm not sure what the right term is, but I think there's an interesting conversation to be had around this modular construction is probably the end game for different chains where you specialize in different, like there's a DA and consensus layer versus different execution layers and all of that stuff. And ZK is a big part of that future. I think it's an interesting conversation to have about what are the different services that the L1 is responsible for providing to its layer 2s or the different chains that are building on top of it. And I think this was Ole from Delta who made this analogy, which I really like, which is I think you're also maybe slowly pulling him on base rollups. A lot of what they're doing is maybe similar to the base rollup vision, but it is, if you look at something like a based rollup versus a classical, just optimistic rollup today, the base rollup gets a lot of benefits from the Ethereum L1, but it's also much more difficult to rip out in general, I would say. And so I've never really been a believer, right, of this like L2s are going to launch their own L1s type thing, because frankly, I just think the benefits that L2s get from the L1 today is far outweighs the whatever costs, like settlement costs that they're paying. But it's not totally impossible for me to see a future where once the cost benefit analysis shifts a little bit for L2s, like maybe a decade into the future or something, it would be theoretically possible for them to do, which is, whereas if you look at something like a base rollup, it's just much more difficult to do that, right? Like the core functionality is so dependent on L1. So yeah, I think the service model, or what are the different services that the L1 provides to its L2 ecosystem, is an interesting conversation to have and be.
For sure. Yeah, one thing I'll add here is that there's like a timeline of what Ethereum Layer 1 wants to offer. And this is like Justin's, I think one of Justin's strongest points is that like Ethereum will be the best on every kind of module in the modular rollup. And, it's not like I think we figured out a way to kind of isolate these things really well in Ethereum. So we have like the execution layer, the consensus layer, and now the blob layer, the data layer. And each of these things can be innovated on in parallel. And we will have like dramatically better solutions to these problems because we've been working on research for DA before any of the all DA teams. And I think we've come to a pretty strong point for like, here's a way to get sufficient DA for like all of the world's financial activity. If you want to use LTA for something else, sure, but we will always have enough capacity. So I just want to kind of break down this timeline. So first we had settlement for rollups. This is kind of the most basic, like add in a little bit of security for your fraud proofs. You're kind of banking on sense of resistance for fraud proofs. But ultimately you're kind of using the layer 1 for this kind of settlement property, which is kind of ambiguous, but that's beside the point, because then we added DA, which is a very useful, valuable service that layer 1 can provide. And blobs really have excellent properties for any Ethereum layer 2 because they are kind of atomically tied to layer 1 blocks. And so you don't have to worry about your DA reorging separately from your settlement. That's even better for base rollups. And then I think now we're talking about sequencing, which is we can use the layer 1 to export the best sequencing in the world and give that to layer 2s. It's going to be probably this year, next year is kind of big service that we have learned how to offer in the best way possible. And then in the future, I think we'll actually offer execution from layer 1 directly. It's called native rollups or native execution. And the concept is that we we've done all the ZK research. The Ethereum Foundation invests millions and millions of dollars into this every year, and we figured out how to do the best ZK. And so we just put this directly in layer one. We have an opcode that not only does ZK verification, but actually does the proving for a rollup. And so this, we can talk about the technical details, but this gets you some really amazing properties, which is that you don't even need real-time proving to do synchronous composability. You can have, tens of seconds of proving time if you delay state root. And we also offer like execution that is exceptionally scalable and exceptionally verifiable. And so there's other teams that are working on this, but if you want to bet against Ethereum, then you do have to bet against the team that shipped the merge and has built the first joint complete blockchain. So I think it's kind of incredible to me that people are still kind of thinking about other alternative modules because Ethereum does have a roadmap to like beating every one of these over time. But that's the thing, is it's very path dependent, and things like Ethereum blobs you can switch away from quite easily. Settlement even easier to switch away from. Base sequencing a little bit more difficult because kind of that switch requires breaking applications. It's not backwards compatible. And then eventually you very well may have execution, and switching away from execution would just basically break everything. And so over time, like I think we've almost done this the opposite than what we would have liked, where we started with like the least sticky services and we're moving towards the most sticky services on this timeline. And unfortunately, that looks really bad. There's a lot of public perception of like layer 2s can leave, right? And I think that is unfortunate, but it will change very quickly as base sequencing starts to like show itself as like a better product, and native execution becomes like by far the cheapest way to get the kind of properties that rollups actually want for their execution. So I think the rollup centric roadmap was like so genius at its time, because the pitch is like, we can let rollups use whatever modules they want, wink wink, but we'll actually just ship those to Ethereum in the next 5 years, and kind of rebundle all of these services once we're ready. But in the meantime, we're not going to lose to Solana because we can we can do things like a mega ETH and kind of slot in other providers before it's ready. But then we knew all along that we're going to beat these in the long term.
All right, so I want to get your perspective on, to realize this rollup centric roadmap, what should the L1 be prioritizing? So this is where I want to get into your discussion around Beam Chain. There was also a really great back and forth in between Martin Koppelman and Justin Drake on an Unchained podcast that I would love to get your reaction to. But this was kind of, let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. But this was the slide that Justin Drake presented at Beam Chain here, where he kind of slotted the I don't know why this is not zooming in, but the consensus layer roadmap into three different buckets. There's the block production bucket, there's staking, and then there's cryptography. And he slotted between P0 to P2, right? So on the P0 for block production, there's censorship resistance, which is fossil, or some implementation of inclusion lists. There's isolated validators, so execution auctions, and then there's faster slots. So he put on here, for example, 4 seconds, right? That's just, I'm not sure where that number is coming from, but just shorter slot times. Then on the staking roadmap, P0 is smarter issuance, so stake cap, something like that. This is some flavor of MVI. Smaller validators, so 1 ETH orbit staking, and then the P2 is faster finality, so 3 slot finality guarantees. And then cryptography, there's chain snarkification as P0, quantum security is P1, and then strong randomness as P2. And so I would love to get your read overall on Beam Chain here and the decision to focus on the consensus layer. And then what do you think about these priorities? Are these roughly right in order to execute what you're describing with your Based Rollup vision?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Based Rollups is that we don't need any changes to layer one. They work perfectly fine today, but they come with like a lot of band-aids. There are ways to improve layer one. The most important is faster finality and shorter slot times, which are both not as prioritized as I would like them to be. But any changes to layer one that make the layer one more resilient and it kind of improves the practical properties of consensus on the layer one simultaneously help layer twos, because they're kind of reusing that consensus. And so something like MaxCB, which is, I don't think it's on here, but will be in Ethereum soon, will kind of modify the bandwidth requirements of Ethereum and increase the kind of available capacity for blobs. So this has like this is good for Based Rollups is because if we want to use blobs, that reduces our cost by a ton. And so, yeah, I mean, overall, my perspective on Beam Chain is that it makes a ton of sense. I think the communication around it was poor because a lot of the actual substance of Beam Chain is not new. Like there's almost nothing new in the kind of Beam Chain proposal. It's all things that we've been discussing over the past few years. It is just a mimetic umbrella to kind of understand and talk about these things and kind of rejuvenate community support for the consensus layer. And also the timeline, right? So 5 years to ship some of these things is absolutely absurd, as Yana would tell you. I think the kind of the way that I would reframe this, and Justin did a great job of explaining this at his Bankless Summit talk, which is that the Beam Chain development on the Beam Chain can happen in parallel to incremental improvements to the consensus layer. And so we can keep doing once a year for the next 5 years. And then at that 5-year mark, do a lot of these kind of P2 things that have that are maybe not top priority, but it would have essentially make the Beam Chain something that we can all survive forever because it's just that good. And so yeah, poor communication, but overall like the direction is good. In terms of priorities, I would love to see less conservative estimates from Justin on slot times and finality. Like I think just having personal conversations with him, he's a lot more bullish on timelines and kind of the technical properties of Beam Chain, but he doesn't want to kind of overestimate and underdeliver. Although I think we could use some of that right now. And so the actual like the priorities here, like I said, I think the most important thing to focus on is how can we make layer 2s better? I said this at the very beginning of the podcast. Rollup Centric roadmap is all about rollups. And so if we end up prioritizing things that are good for layer 1 execution in the short term, I think that will detract from kind of the building the best rollups that we can. And Justin did a great job of like prioritizing things that are really good for rollups. And I want to see more of that. Now, one interesting thing about Beam Chain is it's only a third of the Ethereum roadmap. There's still the data layer and still the execution layer. And these have almost more to do with Based Rollups because data is a huge cost thing for rollups. And execution is key for eventually doing native execution, native rollups, which are great for Based Rollups. And then also the keeping the layer 1 network effect alive and having the capacity to facilitate kind of composability and coordination between multiple Based Rollups. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard to evaluate like the full plan while only taking a snapshot of a third of it. But I think the most important thing for Based Rollups on here is just faster finality and shorter slot times. But, we'll see how the rest of the roadmap ends up looking, of course.
Yeah, so I agree. So on the timeline stuff, I am personally split on that. I think that 5 years sounds like a really long time. On the other hand, I know that Justin was being very conservative with those estimates, and I also am understanding of the fact that Ethereum is in a very different position than almost all of its competitors, right? And it takes a long time. Just look at Bitcoin and how ossified that layer is and how long things take. So I'm more sympathetic on the timeline than I think a lot of others were. I do think on the prioritization side of things, I get fossil and inclusion lists feel extremely important. I agree with you that I think if I had to push back a little bit on how I saw those priorities shaking out is if we want to make things easier for especially Based Rollups, if that's the vision that we're pointing towards, and just roll up interoperability in general, it feels like something like single slot finality or time to finality should be, we should kind of reverse those two priority sets for block production. And I forget what the other one was, but I feel like that might be a slightly more important thing because just having lower slot times and a shorter time to finality actually helps so much with interoperability for L2s, right? Like I could even imagine something like I don't know if you've ever really seriously thought about something like the concept of Based Rollups on Solana, but I think you would need much less surrounding infrastructure because the slot times are so much slower or so much faster, right? So what do you think about, I mean, I'm just curious in terms of like, say more about the prioritization there or, I guess any response to that?
Yeah. I mean, the technical prioritization is sometimes less important than like the social prioritization. That's, one reason we're not building on Solana is that They're not very friendly to the people who want to build rollups.
Rollups,
And like Ethereum has built an entire culture and like off-chain community around supporting these. Like there's no layer 2 beat on Solana. And I think that this is an important part of it. On the technical side though, I think yes, today base rollups would be much better on Solana than they would be on Ethereum. It's like same for Monad, same for like you could build a layer 3 on a centralized equal to a layer 2 and it'd be incredible if it was a base rollup. But the technical properties here are also, you have to think about them practically, and you have to put them in the context of what are you really offering. So if you're doing a base rollup on Solana, you're offering synchronous composability with Solana layer 1, which is like Solana layer 1 offers that with itself. And so the actual like improvement, the commercial improvement, is that customizability. And I still don't know how important that customization and specialization is. But it's a very different value prop for Ethereum because it's not just synchronously composable with Ethereum. It's also way more scale than Ethereum layer 1 mainnet EVM can provide. And so it's, I guess it's less so of like a technical thing and more of a practical thing. It's like Ethereum is also much, much larger than Solana when it comes to network effects. And and just one like kind of anecdote is that the available pool of developers that are familiar with EVM is vastly, vastly greater than those who are familiar with SVM. And so just from a multiple practical perspectives, I think it makes more sense to focus on Ethereum in the short term. But that doesn't mean that like Solana or Monad based rollups would be any less like technically superior.
All right, so this is a part of the conversation that I want to get your perspective on Solana in general. It's funny, you actually just mentioned the network effects. So this question actually comes from Bread Guy, but when I tweeted out that you and I were going to be recording a podcast, his first question was, at what point and what metrics would he deem, that being you, Solana network effects to eclipse Ethereum's? So how do you measure the network effects here?
Yeah, so measuring network effects is kind of difficult because it's not only what are the network effects now, but also like what's the derivative of the network effects? How are they changing? I think I would need to see similar kind of TVL numbers, or at least TVL growth on Solana than I do on Ethereum. And that's important just because, that kind of makes the point that state is actually valuable. And so synchronously composing with it is important. But it's not only like these on-chain things. So we talk about like all the metrics that like DeFi shows, those are all important. I would like to see Solana getting there. But what I care about even more is like the developer education, the developer tooling, and the off-chain infrastructure around Solana. And so if we can see the kind of off-chain infrastructure, like I did my Bankless Summit presentation, had some slides about this, about the research community and developer community that's built up around Ethereum. There's all sorts of open source code, all of these public goods kind of organizations. I'd like to see these built up around Solana. That's a much harder thing to measure though, and it's kind of subjective. And so I'd say kind of the one metric that I like to look at is like developers, full-time developers in an ecosystem. And once Solana eclipses Ethereum layer 1, then I would be a lot more open to kind of comparing those network effects on other metrics, right? Now, the one place that this does get a little bit more complicated is Solana kind of multiplies its network effects because it has so much more scale than Ethereum layer 1. And so even if you had 1/10 of network effects of Ethereum on chain, then if you had 100 times the scale, it still might be, definitely worth it to deploy in Solana because you can do kind of different uses of these metrics. And so it's not only like the TVL, not only like the volume, but also how does the scale of the network take advantage of that TVL and volume and kind of activity as well. So then the final thing I'll mention is that like the number one thing for me will be when there is no longer a practical short-term Ethereum path to outcompeting Solana on scale. So we can talk about the Solana block times being shorter than Ethereum. That's great, but the Solana block times are slower than Arbitrum. So if our only priority was the block time, then we would build Based Rollups on Arbitrum. But obviously it's not. And so it's things like this where the network effects themselves of Solana are you can put numbers on these, but until you can make the case that Ethereum, that Solana will maintain these network effects and grow these network effects, then I think you're in a tough spot. And I also don't think Solana will be able to do that until they do MCP, which I believe is a few years out.
What do you think about multiple concurrent proposers in general, and how for you does that change the based rollup architecture? We did an episode with Anatoly and Max Resnick as well recently, just discussing MCP, and it seems like I can't tell. I asked them right at the end of that episode about how optimistic they were and on what timeline. And obviously, Anatoly has a slightly different position in Solana than Max Resnick does in Ethereum, but I got the sense that this is still a ways away. Solana still has to execute on Fire Dancer, and there's quite a bit of focus there. And then Ethereum, I have less of a great understanding, frankly, about how much Max Resnick is winning his make ETH L1 great again internal push. And so I guess from your perspective, it would be very interesting to get this, like, what are your thoughts on multiple concurrent proposers in general, and how, if at all, does this change the dynamics that we've been talking about this episode?
Sure. So I think it will be great for Solana. I would be super excited about Solana's tech if they end up shipping this. The reason it's so good for Based Rollups on Ethereum or Solana is because it vastly increases the number of leaders that you can run an auction over. And so if there's, in Fossil, as proposed, there are 16 inclusion list committee members, and there's one like proposer leader. And so this is 17 people who have the ability to force transactions versus one. And so that means you can run an auction over 17 people per slot instead of just one person. And if the look ahead stays roughly the same at 32 slots, then that's 32 times 17 auction participants versus just 32 auction participants. And so that dramatically changes the properties of that auction. You can bring tons of efficiency, and it's even more likely that like a highly reputable, kind of trusted node operator will be present in the look ahead. And so if you really want to get your pre-confirmations from Coinbase, then MCP will make it much more likely that Coinbase will be building a block soon. Now, I don't believe in Braid as a technical design. I don't believe it will be included in Ethereum. I think it has some good properties and some very bad ones. That's a discussion for another time. I think Fossil is technically MCP, and I believe Fossil will provide a lot of the benefits that Braid kind of promises, while being somewhat more complex and having.
Could you just actually give an overview of what? Can you just give an overview, Matthew, of what Fossil is, and how does it give similar properties to something like Braid?
Sure. So Fossil is fork choice enforced inclusion lists. And the key about Fossil is that they're committee constructed inclusion lists. And so in some inclusion list designs, they're called proposer generated. Then the one proposer generates one inclusion list and sends this off to like a builder who builds a block according to the constraints established by that inclusion list. Whereas with Fossil, there's a committee of inclusion list generators, 16 according to the current spec, that generate they all generate an inclusion list, and the proposer has to follow these all of these inclusion lists with some caveats, of course. And so the difference to Braid is that the inclusion lists generated by this committee only say things about inclusion. They are inclusion lists, and they do not say anything about ordering. And so in Braid, there's a kind of view canonicalizer, which is the entire network. There's no centralized view canonicalizer. And this means that no single entity has this like last look property that Max doesn't like, which is that kind of one actor has the ability to determine anything more about the sequence of transactions than any other actor. This is important for auctions. But Fossil still provides censorship resistance that's really, really excellent, like top tier censorship resistance, better than any other chain. And it even has kind of the foundations to support on-chain auctions, like Max wants. And it's also like, I think, a lot more practical to implement because it's you don't need any special cryptography things that that Max is hoping that can be developed. So this kind of this like simultaneous release problem that Max is trying to solve is just a really, really difficult technical problem. Even if you did solve it, there's still other problems with Braid, I think. But the if you have solved simultaneous release, then you can get a lot further. But it's just a hard problem. And then on Fossil, like we have there's literally a spec written for the entire Fossil proposal, and the properties of Fossil are, a great improvement to Ethereum today. I think it makes sense that it's a top priority for Justin.
Got it. Okay, helpful. Okay, so overall, multiple concurrent proposers you view as not only being a good design architecture for these L1s, but also being very helpful for Based Rollups because it increases the amount of participants that you can run this auction over. So super interesting. How do you view, I guess I would be curious to get your perspective as well on, could you say a little bit more about this? This is something that gets talked about internally at Blockworks a good amount, but how much is Max Resnick's kind of push winning internally within the Ethereum community? I don't feel like I have a good sense of that. I know that there was a little bit of Twitter back and forth around DevCon, and we don't need to give the specifics around that, but I would just be curious, what's your sense around where the Ethereum community and sort of the core dev builders' heads are at in terms of prioritization here? Are people questioning the Rollup centric roadmap? Are they not? Is there a push that's winning to move a lot of activity back to L1s? The L1, like, what do you think?
Yeah, so based on conversations I've had with Ethereum Foundation people and important kind of Ethereum actors, the Max's push to move back to layer 1 execution is basically dead. There's very little support other than some of these kind of make layer 1 great again circles. And I think part of the reason for that is because we now have just a much clearer roadmap to doing what Max wants on a based rollup at more scale. And I think that even Max has realized this. And so then the question becomes, what about like the censorship resistance properties that can still be applicable to rollups, to based rollups especially? And I think we've seen a much more coordinated kind of push for these with Max's Braid proposal, but also with Fossil. And so I think the community has kind of shuffled some priorities around after Max has kind of highlighted this so well with kind of censorship resistance with on-chain auctions paper. But the kind of technical solution to the censorship problem in a protocol enforced way is Fossil. And there's been dramatically more kind of community alignment around Fossil than there has been about doing Braid. And so, yeah, I mean, the Ethereum Foundation has a lot of sway in kind of what gets pushed, but ultimately it's up to the all core devs. And I do not have as much of an oracle into what they're thinking than I would like. But I'm pretty willing to say that they're much more much closer to including Fossil than they are Braid. And so I would say it's not too late for layer 1 execution to get turned around. And I wouldn't hate if we did some of that in the short term. But I think the censorship resistance element has been extracted from Max's proposal. And just we realize we have a solution for that. It's called Fossil. And so we want to ship that before we risk breaking things in a much larger way.
Okay. Final question for you here. Do you view, this is something that gets talked about quite a bit, but there's sort of a convergence in terms of architecture between some of the different large blockchain ecosystems. So, I mean, it's even, I know I talk about this all the time, right? So, but you look at something like Celestia and Ethereum, their roadmaps look extremely similar, right? They've a slightly different construction in their sovereign rollups, and they've got a neutral bridge in the form of ICP. And they're kind of going for these large blocks at the L1 that come to finality very quickly, the Tendermint consensus, so it's single slot finality for them. Even something like Solana and Ethereum don't look very similar. I guess the big difference is where execution ultimately ends up happening. But if there ever were to be something like multiple concurrent proposers or the Fossil implementation that you just detailed, starting to look slightly more similar there. And even something like Bitcoin, if you were to actually get these ZK rollups, everything's kind of looking a little bit more similar than it certainly used to, where everyone started out. Do you see this convergence? Do you not see this convergence? Do you think there are going to be market differences in terms of different ecosystems on a decade-long time horizon? I know that's really difficult to forecast, but what do you think about this whole "we're all building the same thing" trend?
Yeah, two things. First of all, like, yeah, I mean, I think it's not wrong to say we're all building something similar. I think people like once you start to recognize this, like you really want to go write a blog post about how we're all building the same thing. And I think there's just so much nuance that you skip over with some of this, which is that like we are building very similar things, but it's path dependence that actually matters. And the end games are like not equivalent. Like the Solana end game and the base Ethereum end game are not the same. Like there are important differences to the properties of that actually are reflected for users and app developers, like a verifiability, right? And so I believe that the, you know, I think we're building similar things, but people tend to take this and like extract it to we've came across like the end game architecture for blockchains. Let's go raise for a startup and build that first. I think that's probably wrong. Like I think the reason we're coalescing is because we've realized that there's some element of path dependence here, and ultimately like the way to use network effects that our ecosystem has built in the best way possible is to have some form of ZK, have some form of execution sharding, and multiple concurrent leaders. And different ecosystems implement this in different ways, of course. But I think the fact that we're trending towards a similar architecture is not necessarily like trying to say that we have found like the end game for blockchains. Now, one thing I will say is that if that's correct and we are all building the same thing and all like eventually working towards the same architecture in the end game, then the only thing that matters is path dependence, and Ethereum is winning on network effects. And so if you believe that we are actually building the same thing, then and you're working in some alternative ecosystem, then you're betting that the execution capabilities of that alternative ecosystem, like Solana shipping, are going to outpace Ethereum's existing network effect. I think that's almost certainly true without Based Rollups. Like I said, I say many, many times, we figured out a way to reuse the network effect of Ethereum layer 1, add on parallel innovation for everything you could possibly want in your execution environment, in your sequencing, etc., and do this on layer 2s while still retaining that network effect. And so I think very often, like I think so many people would leave Solana or leave Celestia if they realized that the execution kind of capabilities, as execution, I mean like shipping, of these different ecosystems is you're making a bet that is going to beat out Ethereum's execution capabilities. And Ethereum already has such a massive head start that if the end game doesn't matter, this is the only thing you're betting on. And I think Ethereum now with Based Rollups has the best chance to actually ship towards that vision without changing the layer 1. It's again, that ossification acceleration idea.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, I appreciate it, man. You've done a really great job, by the way, on Twitter as well. There are a couple questions on how you balance your time in between your school responsibilities and also startup and also Twitter. So yeah, you're doing God's work, man. And I also think you're pushing a really positive direction for Ethereum. So definitely keep it up. And if folks are listening out there and they want to figure out, learn more about Spire or how you're helping support teams in their ambitions to build Based Rollups, what's the best way to get in contact with you or your team or whatever?
Sure. So if you're interested in just experimenting with Based Rollups and kind of learning about some of their properties and maybe launching your own one day, then please reach out to me on Twitter or a company at Spire_Labs. We'd be happy to have those conversations. I think the biggest kind of action item for us right now is just hiring. So if you're a passionate developer who has built rollups in the past, maybe you're good with TEs or ZK, then please reach out. We're hiring for every role you can think of. And the last thing I'll say is that if you want to learn more about kind of producing content for Based Rollups, that's something we need a lot more of. I think there's still kind of a massive gap between the core Ethereum Foundation researchers of like, this is what the end game looks like, this is what the roadmap looks like, and everyone else on Twitter, because there's just a failure to communicate a lot of those things. And so if you want to learn how you can help me and help some other people on Twitter, then please do reach out by DM.
Awesome. All right. Well, I really appreciate you hopping on here. We're recording the day after Thanksgiving as well for listeners. So a lot of dedication here, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon.